Today we're going to focus on the Ford F-150 P2007 code, which is an intake manifold rudder problem. To relieve the fuel pressure, we're going to pull the 20 amp fuel pump fuse in the fuse box under the hood, and then we're going to crank the engine over for a few seconds to relieve any fuel pressure off the fuel rail. We're going to disconnect the negative battery cable in doing this repair. And the first step is we're going to remove the intake hose with attachment hoses. This goes from the intake filter housing to the throttle body housing, and just put that up and out of the way. There are 4 intake throttle body bolts here. We can remove these in any particular order. Make sure that you catch the bolts. These are not attached to the throttle body, so make sure that you don't drop these bolts. Try to keep them separated as you're doing your repair. Next, we're going to disconnect the electrical connector on the intake in the front, and we're going to unplug hoses. The fuel rail now is loose, and we're going to unplug the injector fuel rail clips and the fuel rail. There are 6 intake manifold bolts that hold the intake down after the fuel rail has been removed. You can remove these in any order, it really doesn't matter. These bolts are attached to the intake manifold, so you don't have to worry about dropping these into the intake. The lower intake, which is directly below this top intake plenum. There are 3 bolts on each side. These do have a torque value when we install them. And there's a couple of them tucked underneath the firewall. I'm using this electric air ratchet or electric ratchet to remove the 6 bolts. It's a little easier, less stress on your back. There are 5 electrical connectors and a vacuum hose behind. You need to disconnect those. And then we are changing the fuel injector O-rings because we actually dropped 3 of the fuel injector O-rings in removing this fuel rail. So as we remove the injector O-rings, we're going to lubricate the new O-rings with fresh, clean engine oil, and we just push these back into the fuel rail. We need to properly index these fuel injectors so they position with the clips of the electrical clips, and verify that they're pushed into the fuel rail properly so they don't leak. We're going to clean the lower intake and use compressed air after we've cleaned it with some brake clean. I'm removing any fine dust or dirt. We have rags in there to keep dirt from going in. This is the purge valve that's attached to the intake that needs to be transferred, and you might have to transfer some of these other parts on the back. The hose is attached. It's a little easier to put that hose on before you put the intake in the back. There's some electrical connectors. These were hard to get off. They're going to be a little hard to plug in because you're laying across the engine. We're going to torque the intake to 106 inch-pounds in a 35-degree second step. This does have a torque sequence. It's going to move from the center out. And after we do the second step of 35 degrees, we're going to lower the fuel rail down into place. There are 4 bolts on this fuel rail. We want to make sure that you lubricate those O-rings again with clean engine oil as they go into the lower intake. And we want to also make sure that the fuel rail is positioned down as far as it will go. There's a little tab where it bolts down that's directly on the intake. You can verify that it's in place by tapping with my fist here on the sides to make sure that that fuel rail is seated properly. We're going to thread these bolts in with the air or electric ratchet. they are long bolts. I just go till it barely seats onto the rail. And then we're going to torque these bolts with a torque wrench after they get seated to the intake. You don't want to over tighten these because we don't want to pinch any fuel injector O-rings. So the torque value for the rail is 89 inch-pounds first step, and then we're going to go an additional 90 degrees. So we tighten this, and there is a sequence from the front left to the right here, and then the two back bolts. So it's going to have you start in the front. You're going to go to the 89 pounds. After that, we're going to plug in all of the injector fuel rail clips. These are properly indexed again, and they just snap in. So we're going to make sure that they seat in on both sides. And then we have some fuel rail insulators, and these keep heat off the fuel rail and the intake manifold. They're noise reducer foam pads, basically. Just make sure they're installed. We're going to plug in the fuel line on the driver's side of the engine that we disconnected when we pulled the fuel rail. So you push that into place. And then we have some hoses that go, breather hoses, intake manifold, routing hoses, goes to the brake booster, goes all over the place. These hoses attached to the intake. And so there's a spring clip that I'm pushing down on the top one. You need to make sure that that spring clip is secured to the front of the intake. We also have the front where the purge valve is attached to the intake. So that one clips into place. You just push that on and then slide the clip down. There is an electrical plug that you want to make sure and plug back in to that also, just behind the throttle body. So there's one electrical clip in the front, a couple of breather hoses that we disconnected. We're going to plug those back in. And then we're getting ready for the throttle body. So we're going to tighten this to 62 inch-pounds and then an additional 35 degree, I believe it was, torque. And we tighten this. I go in a star pattern. And then we're going to reattach the intake manifold hose. We're going to end the intake hose that goes to the throttle body. So we plug this in, and then we're going to connect the breather hoses. There's one connector up top. There's one that plugs underneath. These go to the valve covers, back to the intake. You'll kind of see how they're routed when you remove that upper intake hose from the air cleaner to the throttle body. You tighten the hoses down to make sure that no dirt or anything will come from the filter housing to the throttle body. And then after we tighten these two hoses back down again, we're going to hook up the battery and put that 20 amp fuse back in to verify to make sure the vehicle starts. And that's it. I would say probably the most struggle I had working on this was disconnecting the electrical clips in the back. We didn't have a way to film back behind there. There are some retaining clips that you have to slide down to unplug those. Other than that, it was pretty simple. Just make sure you keep the lower intake clean, and then the upper intake will just bolt directly down. Those torque values, I hope, helps also.